Saturday Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, it's going to be a show of two halves. In the first half, we're going to focus on domestic issues where the carbon tax continues to dominate, and obviously there's been the riots and mayhem at Christmas Island as well. Next week, Parliament returns, and that'll be the last return of Parliament before the May budget, which is traditionally a time where governments try to get some good news stories out in the lead up to it, but we don't know the state of the budget at this point to know whether Labor will in fact be able to do that. In the second half of the program, we'll be going abroad, as I said, to look at what's happening in Japan as an update, and obviously also to have a bit of a look at Libya, because there's been some pretty interesting events that are fast moving over there. Joining me on the panel for the discussion right throughout the show, on the far end of the panel, Labor Party historian Troy Bramston. Thanks for your company.
Hi Peter, good to be here.
And closest to me, Dr Greg O'Mahony. Thanks for your time as well.
Pleasure, Pete.
And joining us out of Perth, we've got Senator Mathias Cormann, the assistant, the shadow, I should say. He wants to be the assistant treasurer. He's the shadow assistant treasurer. Mathias, thanks for your company as well.
Good to be here.
Mathias, I'll come to you in a moment, but first I just want to set the scene on Garneau's speech at the press club, where he talked about essentially trying to link tax reform to this idea of the carbon tax with some of, I guess, the goodies that are going to go with it. Troy, let me bring you in on this. What was Garneau's point, and what do you make of it?
I think that what Ross Garneau was trying to look here is to really, I guess the term would be to bolt on some additional reforms here. So we've got the carbon price, the government's committed to that. There is an issue about the government's transition measures and assistance measures to households. And he was saying, look, rather than just do the cash handout, let's actually do some structural reform at the same time. So let's make the assistance in terms of tax cuts and possibly some welfare reform to look at participation in the workforce as well.
Mathias Cormann, Ross Garneau, Professor Ross Garneau, pretty respected economist. He's slapped down ignorant people who oppose climate change. He was unclear on Lateline whether he was talking about Tony Abbott or not on that. Tony Jones pressed him on it, but he certainly thinks that climate change and the carbon tax in particular should be linked, as Troy says, to an overall tax reform approach, pulling and picking some of the things out of the Henry Review that haven't been touched to date. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, Professor Garneau is not part of the government. Last time the Labor government talked about tax reform was when we had the Henry tax review, of course, and all we've ended up with was a multi-billion-dollar new tax. It was supposed to deliver a fairer, simpler tax system, and we ended up with a massive new tax on the mining industry, which was manifestly more complex and less fair. So what we've been getting from this government is one new tax after the other, when really, I obviously agree with Professor Garneau that we should have tax reform, and in fact, the government promised to have a tax summit by the end of June this year to pursue exactly that. The problem with Labour is we always end up with a new tax.
You like his idea, though, that if we're going to have to get a carbon tax, I know that the coalition opposes that, but if we're going to have to get it, the sort of the compensation packages should be attached to significant reform rather than just handouts.
Well, let's just separate two things out. We're totally opposed to the carbon tax. It's a tax that would push up the price of everything without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive agreement. But are we in favour of lower, simpler, fairer taxes and serious tax reform? Of course we are.
So your answer is, Mathias, Senator, that if tax reform has to be undertaken, that it should be done so on the back of a policy like this?
No, what I'm saying is that there is a very serious need of tax reform. Under this Labor government over the last 3 years, we had more than $40 billion in new taxes. Invariably, these are ad hoc tax grabs rather than taking a strategic look at our tax system. And what we ought to have is a very serious tax reform process with a commitment to lower, fairer, simpler taxes. But of course, the carbon tax is a totally separate issue, and it's one that we oppose.
Senator, can I just jump in there and say that what's your position on Garneau's comment about the naysayers in this debate belonging to the Yugoslav model? Do you think that's fair criticism?
I'm not aware of what the Yugoslav model is, but what I do know is that we had a very comprehensive debate about whether or not there should be a price on carbon in the lead up to the last election, and in fact all throughout the last parliament. And of course that debate changed in Copenhagen. Putting a price on carbon in Australia doesn't make sense in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement to price carbon emissions.
Does Malcolm Turnbull agree with you on that?
Well, you'd have to ask. I'm sure that Malcolm Turnbull supports the coalition position, which is that we do not support a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement. Well, you'd have to ask him, but I'm very confident that he supports a coalition position.
Senator, can I just jump in there and ask you? You've made it clear that the coalition are not going to support a price on carbon or the government's emissions trading scheme. But could you see the coalition adopting significant tax reform or reform to welfare? So let's just imagine the government does come up with a package of reform in this space, taking up some of the Henry Review ideas.
Maybe fight back Mark II,
and some welfare reform ideas. Could you see the coalition supporting that, but not actually supporting an emissions trading scheme?
Well, I mean, the coalition is in favour of lower, simpler and fairer taxes, and we do think that there ought to be a very, very serious tax reform process undertaken in this country. And of course it's something which the government promised to the independents, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, would happen before the end of June 2011. It'll be interesting to see whether indeed it will happen.
Let me move on to another issue, and Greg, I'll start with you. There's been a lot of discussion this week about the relationship between Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister, now Foreign Minister, and Julia Gillard. Rudd's doing his job. He's in the media a lot. There's a lot of international issues that we're going to talk about in the back half of this show that are dominating events at the moment. But he's certainly putting himself out there. There's some suggestion from some quarters that he's doing it to rile Gillard, or even if that's not his motive, that is the consequence of the way that he's coming across. Laurie Oakes, in his article today, talked about how prime ministerial Kevin Rudd has looked with some of his utterings. What's your take on this?
Well, it's not hard to look presidential or prime ministerial when day in, day out you're talking about Libya, a World War II type event in Japan, and what's happened in New Zealand. While he's been doing that, Gillard's had to deal with Abbott. She's going toe-to-toe with him day in, day out, and she's having to push this really tough agenda of the carbon tax. So she looks a bit like a local mayor at the moment compared to Rudd, and he is loving every minute of it. And I think he'll be delighting at the moment about the discussion we've just had. Garno is trying to link the two great thorns in the side of the Labor Party for the last 4 years, the ETS and tax reform, the Henry Tax Review.
Senator Cormann, let me ask you, I mean, do you think that Kevin Rudd did a good job with helping play a role on the international stage to bring the no-fly zone into effect through the UN?
Well, I mean, I think that the comment just now is exactly spot on. I think he's enjoying every minute of the work that he's doing at the moment, and he's enjoying showing up the Prime Minister.
Do you give him credit for that work, though? I mean, he was out pretty hard and pretty early on the no-fly zone, and that's ultimately what the UN's done.
Are you saying thank you to him,
he was out there very early and very hard, and he is taking great delight in showing up the Prime Minister in the process. I mean, he's working very hard to become the next captain of the Broncos, the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I think that Kevin Rudd is certainly looking like an international roadrunner at the moment. He's out there doing everything, talking about everything. And if you look in the Australian today, Greg Sheridan said that Rudd played an important role. He wasn't the reason there's a no-fly zone, but he said he did help push the issue over the line.
Has he sounded you out about rejoining the team?
No, he hasn't actually, but I wouldn't be available. But he is out there pushing all these issues, getting his profile up, working as hard as he ever has. But it is right that it doesn't look good in terms of the relationship with the former Prime Minister. There's always going to be speculation about that.
Well, I'm surprised that Gaddafi, in one of his statements, didn't talk about the pressure that he's felt under since Kevin Rudd took up the cause of the no-fly zone. But Senator Cormann, let me come at it from another angle. Do you think, I mean, quite seriously, the relationship between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, there's an issue there. Do you think it's as bad as the relationship between Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott?
The relationship between Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard is completely dysfunctional, and that is a very, very serious issue.
Almost as bad as the relationship between Abbott and Turnbull.
Well, I think that Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull have a very good relationship, but what the problem is here is that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of this country have a dysfunctional relationship, and that is most certainly not in our national interest, and it ought to be resolved.
You say that, Senator, and it's easy to... I mean, we have delighted in this show from time to time on saying a few harsh things about Kevin Rudd, but you'd have to say...
Speak for yourself.
I mean, you've been one of his biggest fans, and you've worked for him. But, Senator, you'd have to agree that in the early days of the Libyan crisis, credit where credit's due, it was Kevin Rudd and Cameron from England who led the charge on this, while people like Angela Merkel equivocated. I think he deserves some credit.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, and in the process he's shown up Julia Gillard. Well, he's shown up Julia Gillard in the process, but from a broader point of view, though, it is not in our interest. Yeah, well, and Julia Gillard was not backing him up when she was there in the US, and I think that is widely recognized. Like when she was put under the pump, she was not prepared to back him up. So if he's providing leadership and she's following in his lead, I'm not sure that is necessarily the way this is supposed to work.
Senator, can I just ask you a question about the carbon tax versus Tony Abbott's direct action or real action plan? One of the lines that the government are trying to get up, they're not doing it very well, but I actually think that there's some effectiveness behind the line if they get their messages a little bit better, is that the government's plans to provide compensation back to individuals, and it's likely to probably tax business more, whereas your plans to take consolidated revenue, i.e. taxpayers' money, and use it to help supplement big business through the real action with the handouts that are given to business. How do you counter that argument?
Well, our direct action plan reduces emissions in Australia in a way that reduces emissions in the world, whereas Julia Gillard's carbon tax and the emissions trading scheme, if we ever get to it, reduces emissions in Australia in a way that increases emissions in other parts of the world, possibly by more than they've reduced them in Australia in the first place. So under Julia Gillard's plan, people in Australia are asked to make a sacrifice. They're asked to pay more. The economy is put under pressure and so on, without actually helping to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what this is supposed to be all about.
So,
our
Senator,
plan
can you understand, Senator, how people are cynical when they hear you say that? When you've got a leader who's on the record as saying he doesn't believe in climate change, and only 4 days ago said he thinks the science, the jury's still out. Can you understand that as you say that, people are thinking, you guys don't believe it, it's just a political ploy?
We have a bipartisan commitment in Australia to reducing emissions, and to reducing emissions to a minimum of 5%. And I guess the argument that we ought to be having in Australia is how we can make the best and most effective contribution to reducing emissions in the world out of Australia. And I guess something to bear in mind here is that there's actually some industries, like LNG, for example, that can help us reduce emissions by more in other parts of the world, even though that would lead to increased emissions in Australia. So the argument around the carbon tax and emissions trading can be a little bit simplistic.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, what's the point of reducing emissions by 5% of 2000 levels by 2020? And the reason I ask that is we don't have a global agreement. You, the coalition, just like the government, are committed to this 5% target by 2020. But as I understand it, we have less than 1.4% of the world's total emissions. Now, if we're going to cut our emissions by 5%, I haven't worked out what 5% of 1.4% is, but I'm pretty sure it's small and insignificant. And this is at the same time that countries like China, for example, are building 50,000 skyscrapers apparently between now and 2020. What is the point of us putting ourselves through either a carbon tax or indeed the hundreds of millions of dollars that you guys are going to spend on real action when we're talking about 5% of 1.4% of global emissions if we even reach the target?
Look, I mean, that's a fair question, Peter, but at the end of the day, our efforts in Australia will always be proportional, will have to be proportionate to what has to happen in other parts of the world. But the key question here, though, is if we reduce emissions in Australia in a way that increases them by more in other parts of the world, which I think is which I would argue is what the carbon tax would do, then we actually are no better off. Whereas the direct action plan that we're putting forward is actually reducing emissions in a way in Australia that reduces them by the equivalent amount, proportionately speaking, globally. And that's what this is all about.
So, Senator, can I ask if you believe that the climate change science has been settled and that climate change is real, or do you think there's still some question marks over that science?
Well, there's always question marks about science, but I believe that we ought to do everything in Australia that we can reasonably do to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. But I think we ought to be having a debate in Australia about how we can make the best, most sensible contribution to those global efforts. And in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement, a carbon tax, an ETS, or any other way of putting a price on carbon is not that.
Senator, we have to take a commercial break, but will you stay with us? I'd like to ask you after the break for your opinion on Christmas Island with the events there before we go abroad on the panel and discuss overseas events. You're watching Saturday Agenda. We will be back in a moment.
If you want to renovate your new kitchen or bathroom, guess what? You can do it right here at Bunnings. If you want to add value to your home, we have it all here for you at the lowest prices.
Straight line kitchen from $1,750. Bypass pruner $694. Home light blower vac $59.90. 25 litre potting mix $643. If you happen to find a cheaper price on a stocked item, we'll beat it by 10%.
We have your new kitchen or bathroom right here at Bunnings.
Bunnings Warehouse! Lowest prices are just the beginning.
I just wanna be okay, be okay, be okay. I just wanna be okay today. I just wanna be okay, be okay.
If you're a safe driver, switch to Allianz Car Insurance and save up to 10% from day one. Plus, up to 10% off the discounted price when you buy online. Click or call today. Allianz, a world of protection.
Is your term deposit really a sweet deal? Some banks might not give you a great rate when you roll over your term deposit, but I always get a competitive new rate plus a loyalty bonus. And I even choose the exact maturity date. It's a triple sweet deal. How sweet is yours?
For fairer banking, open an ING Direct personal term deposit online today and enjoy a sweet 6.5% per annum for 1 year. Plus a little extra when you roll over. ING Direct.
It's your money.
Can you find better value than sporty Lancer SX with spoiler, alloy wheels and 7 airbags? And its best feature, just $29.90 drive away. Put Mitsubishi to the test today. Love that car.
My degrees from the University of Western Australia
formed the foundation upon which I built my career.
My UWA experience enabled me to achieve goals
far beyond what I ever imagined were reachable.
We all want to live in a safer world, where life's little mishaps can be fixed with a simple wave, and staying comfortable and in control is easy. Until the world becomes that place, choose the safer tyre. Taranza by Bridgestone.
For 1 week only, Jetstar is giving away free flights. Just apply for a Jetstar MasterCard or Jetstar Platinum MasterCard by midnight Eastern Daylight Savings Time March 20, and if you're approved and activate your new card by April 12, you'll receive a free one-way flight to any Australian Jetstar destination in May or June. This offer is for successful new applicants only. But hurry, you'll need to apply by midnight March 20.
If you love travel, you'll love this card.
Back, you're watching Saturday Agenda, where I'm joined here in the studio on the panel by Troy Bramston and Dr. Greg O'Mahony, and out of Perth by Senator Mathias Cormann, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer. Senator Cormann, can I ask you first, before we go overseas and look at Libya and Japan, Christmas Island, events significant there. It's not quite overseas, although Howard did excise it from our migration zone. What do you make of those events, and can the rioting and so forth there in any way be linked to a problem with government policy?
Well, I mean, these were terrible events this week, but they are the direct consequence of Labor's failed approach to our border protection policies. I mean, Labor has completely lost control, and the reason you can pinpoint the time when all of this started, you can pinpoint it back to August 2008, when the federal Labor government softened the very strong and robust policy framework that was put in place by the Howard government. We said then that these sorts of things were going to happen, and here we are. It's tragic, it's terrible, and it was completely unnecessary.
All right, Senator Cormann, we'll let you go. We're going to go overseas and look at Libya and Japan. We appreciate you getting up and joining us over there in Perth. Thanks for your time.
Good to be here.
Gentlemen, let's look at Libya. Broadly speaking, you know, the situation in Libya is slightly unusual. You've got Gaddafi that has been bombarding his citizens and storming, or looking to storm, Benghazi, and then we have the international community belatedly, in my view, finally acting for a ceasefire and a little bit more than that. We're not sure what it involves, other than it won't involve an occupation force. That's what the resolution said. And now suddenly you've got Gaddafi coming out and saying, or his spokespeople coming out and saying that, you know, it's all fine. How can it all be fine? There are two governments in Libya. It's a divided nation. It's effectively a civil war. How long can any ceasefire seriously hold?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And Gaddafi's son has said in the last 24 hours, not sure what all the fuss is about. As a responsible member of the UN, we're announcing a ceasefire. The problem with that is that 24 hours earlier, his dad was pledging to crush the second largest city in the country.
Well, and to bomb foreign planes and merchant navy vessels in the Mediterranean if the international community acted against his government.
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly nuts over there. I mean, and they don't know what's going on. I mean, really. I mean, let's just call a spade a spade.
Defamation laws being what they are. It could launch an action against you in the local district court.
If I'm going to be accused of defaming Gaddafi, then bring it on. Bring it on. I'm happy to fight that in any court. But look, I mean, I think the thing here is that this is really his Saddam moment, really, because I mean, if he turns around and stops the attacks on the insurgents, participates with the international community, says he's going to withdraw, then he may well be able to stay in power. And that's what Saddam failed to do, didn't he?
That's the serious issue, isn't it? Has he learnt from the mistakes of Saddam, for example? He's cooperating in a way that allows him to maintain power. And I don't for a second, Greg O'Mahony, believe that he will suddenly become this nice guy that doesn't seek vengeance on his opposition forces. I just think that by doing what he's doing as a facade to the international community, he can get on quietly in the domestic context with seeking revenge.
I don't think there's going to be a lot of quiet in the domestic context. I think if you look at the framing of this UN resolution, the use of the words all necessary measures, almost unprecedented in terms of humanitarian intervention.
Well, and the thing there, Greg, is I guess that it leaves open the option that there might be troops at some stage. I mean, some of the initial reporting said there'll be no ground troops, and that's right in the initial stages. But I think the resolution is sufficiently open to allow troops or some kind of physical enforcement of the no-fly zone at some point.
Well, here's a question for you both. What is wrong with China, Russia, the permanent members of the Security Council, as well as other nations like Germany, I think, and there was a total of 5 that abstained. Now, they didn't vote against the resolution for a no-fly zone, but they abstained. I mean, what does it take for these guys to think that the international community should get off its backside and do something?
I agree. I think Germany's behaviour in this has been disgraceful. I mean, Merkel has said from day one, we're not going to do anything without the support of the Arab League. The Arab League has not been able to get its act together for the better part of 2 decades.
I have to jump in there.
No, it has. But
22 nations, 20 of them, I think, supported a no-fly zone, and they did that on Monday. Yet here we've got the international community on the back of having that localised support dithering for so long. I mean, what does China and Russia need? Do they need Libya to actually launch missiles at them for them to decide to do more than abstain when tens of thousands of Libyans are getting slaughtered?
I think probably, and I think a lot of people were surprised that China and Russia didn't veto. I think it is amazing that they abstained, given the history.
Is it a reflection of those two countries not liking the idea of the international community peering its eye into domestic affairs? Because, let's face it, China doesn't exactly have a scintillating human rights record, and Russia is not exactly a country that has moved as much towards democracy as many of us might have hoped over the last decade.
Well, I think that's undoubtedly the case, and it's a throwback to the post-World War II settlement, which gave these permanent powers a right of veto on the Security Council.
Then what's Germany doing? I mean, if that's their excuse for not for abstaining, I should say, rather than backing the motion, what is Germany's excuse?
Well, I think there are all these bizarre relationships, to do with the Middle East and Europe and so on. I mean, the French were a country that actually, had a bizarre relationship with Iraq.
They refused, to the last moment any kind of military involvement there, yet all of a sudden they could hardly be waving the flag more strongly about getting on with the job of attacking Libya. What's that all about?
You get the impression if the French were left to their own devices, they'd actually be storming Tripoli. The sort of language you've seen out of the capital, out of Paris the last couple of weeks, I'm sure that's partly domestically driven.
And then they'd probably lose every war like they have throughout the last 2 centuries.
Yeah.
Isn't there an irony here that Tunisia falls, Egypt falls, and as much as those two dictators were brutal in their own way, they were nothing compared to Iran, nothing compared to Bahrain, certainly nothing compared to Gaddafi. Yet these guys all seem to be surviving because they are learning from the mistakes of perhaps what you might call the weaker dictators that gave up too early. Mubarak must be sitting back at his villa thinking, gee, I really should have just found a way to emulate Gaddafi. I acted too soon in pulling out.
Yeah, and not that it's a dictatorship, but I think a very significant development in the region this week has been the Saudi troops going into Bahrain. There's no natural reason for that to happen.
Offering support.
Yeah, offering support. And the interesting thing about it is that Saudi offered to do that well before it was invited, and that is the Saudi king, very worried about the fact that he's got the biggest population in the Gulf outside of Iran. There's 12% unemployment, and if Saudi goes, it's a massive development for the Gulf. It would probably spark an oil spike the likes of which the world hasn't seen.
In the time we've got left, Troy, Japan, the nuclear side of things there is obviously becoming the emerging international story, the concerns about the nuclear radiation leaks. What has this done to the nuclear power debate, do you think? Not just in this country, but worldwide.
Well, I think, firstly, in this country, it's killed the debate stone dead. I mean, there's nobody is now in the Labor Party or in the Liberal Party going to get up there and argue the case for nuclear power, which I think is
Has anyone died? I think one person's died attached to this radiation leak. Why are we so quick to move on this idea that that's the end of the nuclear debate. I mean, if a wind turbine falls over and lands on a sightseer, we don't decide that that's the end of wind power and solar energy. Or a coal mine accident where thousands of people die every year.
I think you're right. I just think that nuclear was always going to be a much harder sell. You know, Chernobyl and 5 Mile Island or whatever it is. I mean, all these examples. It's always going to be a much tougher sell.
It's the fear of the unknown, isn't it? Radiation.
It is the fear. I mean, there's huge fear. I mean, it's couched in the image of the end of the Second World War. And the bombings in Japan there and all these kind of images. I mean, it's disastrous. So I think anybody who wants to run that debate, which actually is a sensible debate actually, because if you really want to tackle climate change, nuclear power is the way to go, and it's widespread in Europe.
Well, Greg, that's the fascinating thing. We're in a situation where the big domestic debate is tackling climate change, how do you do it? The big international debate emerging out of Japan is that nuclear power is perhaps dead in the water now, yet that is identified by most people, greenies aside, as the only way that you can seriously tackle climate change in a sustainable way.
Yeah, that's right. The biggest beneficiaries of the events of the last 2 weeks, I would have thought, are coal mining companies and LNG companies. And it's pretty hard to argue with that. The market's telling you that.
You've been investing with them?
Been looking at them very closely, Peter. But no, the truth is it's a bleak day. The market's telling you that uranium is not going to be sold anything like it has been the last few years, and quite possibly for very good reason.
All right, we've got less than a minute on program. Let me ask you both, what are you expecting from the parliamentary week, last one before Budget Day? Very quickly, Troy.
I think the government will just be trying to wrap up a whole bunch of bills. There's not going to be anything controversial until the Greens take control of the Senate, and then the government will be able to negotiate properly to get some significant things through.
Greg O'Mahony?
I think there'll be a leadership challenge on Wednesday. Kevin Rudd. Prime Minister by Saturday.
You know that's not going to happen, but if it does happen, you'll be expecting this to be replayed ad nauseum. Gentlemen, Troy Bramston, Greg O'Mahony, appreciate your company this morning on Saturday Agenda.
Pleasure, Pete.
And thanks for your company as well. Make sure you tune in tomorrow for Paul Kelly and my interview on Australian Agenda with Prime Minister Julia Gillard joining us live in the studio. It should be a good one. Thanks for your company. See you again next week.